Hello, this is Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. My name is Stephen Meyer, and this is part 4 of my series entitled Heavy Music Visionaries, Inventors, Innovators, and Followers. And this is a 7-part series, and throughout, I highlight many of the artists who have pushed heavy music forward. I'm using an inventors, innovators format, and I believe many issues surrounding hard rock and heavy metal can be clarified using this approach. So we're going to get right into part 4 in just a second. But before I do that, just a wee little recap. So in part 2 of this series, I spend a fair amount of time distinguishing between hard rock and heavy metal. And one of the key distinguishing factors is that I believe hard rock is ultimately an innovation, whereas heavy metal is an invention. So you can kind of see by my little diagram here that I'm coding inventions in red and innovations in green, at least the border of each of the categories. Hard rock, as far as I'm concerned, while a significant innovation on what came before, is nevertheless not entirely a new form of music. It's not an invention. So hard rock was based on rock, right, in itself, an innovation, which was based on rock and roll from the 1950s. Now, I believe rock and roll was different enough from what came before to be called a true invention, right? And rock and roll was, yes, an outgrowth of blues and rhythm and blues in particular, which also was an invention. But again, each of these differed enough to be called something new, right? Whereas an innovation is a development on something that's already occurred, right? And that's what I think hard rock ultimately is. And there are some major differences between hard rock and heavy metal. The two forms are often confused. And so check out part 2, or I go into a lot more detail on that. Progressive rock, the one form of rock as an outgrowth, I guess, that I do consider an invention is indeed progressive rock, because it is very different from rock and roll, and also heavy metal. Heavy metal, to me, although it is fair enough, I think, to call heavy metal an outgrowth of hard rock and indeed rock, right? Heavy metal is distinct enough that we should consider it a new form of music. It is indeed an invention, okay? And so where we start with part 4, and I'll go to yet another diagram before we dig into the text part here. If we start with the idea of heavy metal as a new invention developed in the late 1960s, early 1970s, as I talk about in part 2, then I'm arguing that all of the subgenres that heavy metal divided into sort of in the 1980s and forward, so thrash metal, death metal, black metal, doom metal, power metal, there's many others. I'm arguing these are all innovations on the original heavy metal blueprint. All of these are distinct. All of these are incredibly important. All of these are developments, right? Key innovations. But I don't think any of them are different enough to be called a true invention, okay? But there are complementary outside inventions that have been absolutely crucial for heavy metal to move into all of these subgenres. And they are things like that. Really, they're techniques involved in playing the music. So palm muting, tremolo picking for guitar players, distorted vocals, and blast beat drumming, right? All of these, and you'll see I coded these blue because I think these can be considered both inventions and innovations depending on the context. They're inventions in their own right. And these techniques were developed way before heavy metal was even invented. But they're also innovations because, again, the incorporation of these inventions help move the invention of heavy metal towards the innovations of the subgenres, right? So these outside inventions were part of the innovative process for heavy metal. right? So I'm going to try to explain this a little, this diagram in part 4. Alrighty? So let's roll. And as always, you can check out the entire text if you'd rather read this rather than listen to me ramble on in YouTube. Links provided below, as always. Okay, so metal's subgenres as innovations. So let's start with just a little bit of background here. The fracturing of heavy metal. So by the early 1980s, heavy metal had become so diverse in style that reasonably well-defined subgenres began to emerge. Probably the earliest of the key subgenres in heavy metal was thrash metal. Okay, and again, there's lots of great thrash metal bands I could list. Here are some of the, I guess, some of the better known ones. Probably most folks who are familiar with heavy metal will know about the high-profile big four of thrash. So Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth, and Anthrax, right? But other examples, and again, there's many, but Exciter, an early thrash metal band or speed metal band, but they're definitely thrash, I would say. Canadian band, actually, out of Ottawa. Testament, also an early thrash metal band. Creator, Destruction, and Sodom, sometimes referred to as the big three in German thrash, right? And there's many others. Exodus. Some people like to include Exodus with the big four. I don't, possibly that's not a bad idea. Again, so those would be examples of really important key thrash metal bands. So regarding thrash, along with being exceedingly fast, it also incorporated an important attitudinal shift towards no compromise and was fueled by the metal underground's increasing frustration with the blatant sellout of certain segments of heavy music. And a lot of that occurring especially during the early days of videos, when MTV was just starting, etc. Okay. Now, the Seattle grunge movement of the mid-1980s gets most of the publicity for killing off over-commercialized rock. And again, by, the Seattle grunge movement, some of the big bands, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Mudhoney, Screaming Trees. There were lots of them, and a lot of metal in what some of these bands did, especially, say, Soundgarden and Alice in Chains. But anyway, it's the grunge bands that get a lot of credit, if you like, for killing off the over-commercialized rock, right? But really, I would argue thrash was just as strong a reaction in the metal community. But let's be honest, in reality, nothing was completely killed off here. And hair metal, which again was the over-commercialized side of hard rock, if you like, became recognized as a subgenre. Even if paradoxically, there's really nothing metal about hair metal, it's basically poppy hard rock, right? I mean, again, we're talking about Motley Crue, Rat, Cinderella, Warrant, Wiener, Poison, these types of bands, right? I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. It's not really my cup of tea. I mean, certain bands that got allocated to hair metal, I think, are okay. I like early Twisted Sister and Wasp, for instance. A lot of it's not my cup of tea. But anyway, hair metal is indeed another subgenre of metal, even though it sort of isn't metal. And in a lot of ways, I believe grunge for sure, but also thrash was a reaction to it, right? Okay, so at about the same time, just sort of, again, talking about some of the subgenres here, a counterbalance to the breakneck pace of thrash emerged in the form of doom metal, with its unmistakably super heavy and slow tones, with at times psychedelic-like droning layers of amplified feedback, right? So if you're a fan of doom metal, you'll know that's probably a pretty good description, right? I actually really like doom metal as well. Again, lots of those bands out there, but Saint Vitus would definitely be one of the earlier ones out of California. Candlemass from Sweden, excellent example of a doom metal band. Pentagram, another early American doom metal band. Crowbar out of New Orleans, excellent. Paradise Lost from Britain, great doom metal band. Electric Wizard, lots of droning going on there, and then a whole lot of droning going on with Sun. et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of doom metal bands we could mention. Doom metal, and to some degree its close cousin stoner metal. Some people consider doom metal and stoner metal kind of one and the same. Others will separate the two. I would tend to separate them a little bit myself. But anyway, good examples of stoner metal, the Melvins, also well connected with the grunge scene in Seattle as well. Orange Goblin, Monster Magnet, especially early Monster Magnet, Red Fane, and others. As it turns out, a lot of stoner metal really comes out of the U.S., I would say, or at least the early stuff. And anyway, doom metal and stoner metal both were indeed more than a casual nod to the heaviest of metal's co-founders, right? So a lot of it you can see heavily influenced by Black Sabbath, Budgie, Blue Cheer, these types of bands, right? And some people will view doom metal as somewhat of a throwback, right? And I understand that, but nevertheless, most bands within these clusters, doom or stoner, played at such an exaggerated sloth pace and or created unworldly heavy atmospheres to justify subgenre status. I believe that. I think they certainly doom metal or stoner metal is not a new invention, as I don't think any of the subgenres are, but it's certainly different enough to be called a new innovation, I believe, right? Even though it maybe isn't as far removed from traditional heavy metal as, say, thrash is or some of the other subgenres. Okay, going forward a little more and just filling in a couple more holes of some of these subgenres. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, even more extreme metal subcategories started firing up. And a good example would be death metal, right? And again, lots and lots and lots of great death metal bands I could mention, but some of the more common ones, I guess, Possessed, Death, probably the two of the earliest death metal bands, maybe Sepultura. Early Sepultura sometimes gets called death metal. But Obituary, Morbid Angel, Deicide, I mean, along with Death, that's an important Florida cluster of death metal that emerged in the late 80s. Cannibal Corpse is also sort of connected with that, even though they originally were out of Buffalo. Suffocation, Incantation, Immolation, three bands that were part of the important death metal New York scene, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So death metal's coming out. Another really important subgenre is black metal. There's probably an early stage black metal and a later stage black metal. So the initial first generation black metal bands would have been Venom, for sure, Bathory, Hellhammer / Celtic Frost, right? Maybe you'd throw Merciful Fate in there from Denmark. And then later on, some of the second generation black metal bands, Absu from Texas, actually. Didn't have a whole lot of black metal bands early on from the US. Absu was somewhat unique. Had a whole lot of really great second generation black metal bands coming out of Norway. So Mayhem, Enslaved, Immortal, Emperor, Dark Throne. I mean, there was lots of really good ones. Anyway, death metal and black metal, these hyper-aggressive subgenres borrowed some aspects of doom metal. I mean, they were pretty creepy, that sort of thing. But for the most part, were feral extensions of thrash, as bands upped the ante in their no-compromise stance and technical prowess. These bands you might not like them, but they certainly could play their instruments. And relentless musical explorations, especially, I would say, black metal. Some black metal bands are some of the most progressive, I would say, in the general sense of the word that we have in metal. They're just constantly exploring and changing, etc. Incredibly interesting, I think. Okay, and that's just a few examples of the subgenres. Because since then, heavy metal has continued to fragment into a maze of classes. Wikipedia provides one interpretation, and there's lots of other sources you can check on this, but I'm gonna mention the Wikipedia approach because most people will probably look at this. Wikipedia provides one interpretation in which 25 main categories of heavy metal are listed, right? So 25 subcategories, subgenres, right? Again, in addition to the ones I've already mentioned, there's alternative metal, folk metal, which almost sounds like a contradiction, but yep, it exists. Industrial metal, metalcore, neoclassical metal, progressive metal, which I'll talk about more going forward, funk metal, and on it goes, right? And what's interesting, in addition to these 25 subcategories, most of these contain several subcategories, if you like, right? So subgenres, you know. So for example, black metal has 8 subgenres. Doom and death metal each have 5 subgenres, right? So as you can see, this sort of this huge pyramid of heavy metal starts to emerge, right? And it gets fairly complex, right? All these different subgenres and subgenres and subclasses, and on it goes, right? But having said all that, I argue that these heavy metal subclasses, while often quite distinct, right, are not inventions, okay? To my ears, all are distinguishable extensions on the original heavy metal blueprint, right? And thereby are innovations, okay? Yet, specific technique-based inventions help spur some of these developments, okay? So much like the aforementioned soft drink and automobile scenarios, which I talked about in part 1, right, to put this all in context, the musical creation of heavy metal integrated a number of other complementary inventions along the way, okay? Even if various inventions in guitar playing, drumming, and vocal styles, which I'm going to get to, cannot be definitively time-stamped, we can't say exactly when this stuff occurred, we know each have origins that extend back well before the invention of heavy metal. Typically from very different musical and performance arts of the past, all right? So I'm going to explain this in a little more detail. That's where we're going to go with this. But just to make sure, you know, that I'm clear here, let's just take a second again to just put this in context. So in part 1, because when this framework of inventions and innovations, typically when we talk about that, we're usually talking about, say, consumer products or consumer services or producer products, that sort of thing, right? And again, as always, an invention is something that's new, hasn't been before, and an innovation is a development on something a significant development, I might add, on something that's already occurred. So we use the examples in part 1, you know, and then we got into music really quickly, but to put it in context, how we usually see inventions and innovations with automobiles and colas, right? So again, the example of colas was the original invention of Coca-Cola occurred in 1886, right? And then there's been all kinds of advancements and developments in colas since then, but one of them was the movement towards sugar-free colas, right? So I'm arguing that cola, as shown in red, was an original invention, but the sugar-free cola that came, you know, a few decades later was an innovation on the original cola idea. A significant change, but still not an invention and an innovation on what happened before, right? But important to this process was the invention of various sugar-free sweeteners, right? Saccharin and stevia and that sort of thing, right? And the sugar-free sweetener, as you can see, I've coded it in blue. It's both an invention and an innovation, okay? It's an invention in its own right, sugar-free sweetener. Somebody had to invent that. But it's an innovation within the cola to sugar-free cola process. It's part of the innovative process that brought colas towards the sugar-free cola, right? So in a similar way, that's how I'm treating the metal subgenres, right? So we have the original invention of heavy metal, the heavy metal subgenres as innovations, and then we've got these independent yet complementary inventions that were important, right? Palm muting, tremolo picking, etc., and moving heavy metal towards the subgenres. Okay? All right, we're going to really start to pick up on how these complementary inventions help move heavy metal towards the subgenres. Okay, that's what I'm going to talk about now. Okay. So, where did all this extreme metal come from? Right? Well, really, again, it's by utilizing these complementary inventions, as we're going to see. So, Chord choices, song arrangements, and the like of most thrash, death, and several black metal songs are or were not new. Okay? Indeed, Metallica, Slayer, Creator, Venom, Obituary, etc. relied just as much on bar chords and fifths as did Black Sabbath and Judas Priest, for example. And for the most part, they utilized verse, chorus, bridge structures in their songs. Yeah, there were exceptions, of course. Like if you take the example of Metallica, Metallica has lots of very progressive epics where, yeah, the song structure can kind of go in all kinds of different places, right? But for the most part, most of Metallica's songs rely on the verse, chorus, bridge structures, right? Something that's been in metal kind of since the beginning, and indeed in all kinds of different music way previous to heavy metal, okay? Yet, the integration of palm-muted, downstroked, and or tremolo picking styles, guitar picking styles, were revolutionary in the metal community for guitar players wanting to play extremely fast, but with no loss in clarity and precision. Okay, so just a few words on that, especially for people that aren't necessarily guitar players. Palm muting, what we're talking about there is the right sort of picking hand, right? What happens is you sort of deaden the strings as you're playing them with your palm, essentially. Okay, so instead of hitting a string open where you get ding, right? You palm mute it and it's do, right? So the reason you do that is that even when you're playing really fast, you can hear all of the notes, right? If you don't palm mute when you're playing really fast, it really just sounds like, there's no definition in the notes. Where if you're palm muting, it's you can actually hear each of the notes. Plus, palm muting tends to bring on a much more heavier sort of vibe in the playing as well, right? Another thing that a lot of thrash players were using at the time too, especially in the rhythm parts of the guitar and in the riffs, was a lot of emphasis on downstroking. So instead of up and down picking, just a lot of downstroking, right? Again, what it would do while palm muting, that would make it sound much heavier, right? Tremolo picking was actually different from downstroking. That is where you're hitting the string, strumming up and down, but you do it incredibly fast. Again, usually while you're palm muting. And again, what it does is it creates almost a swarming kind of sound. Again, if you're not palm muting and you're just tremolo picking, it'll just sound like just a wave of sound. Whereas if you're palm muting, you'll get that, but if you're picking really, really fast, you get this really swarming kind of effect, right? Okay, so my point here is thrash and death metal guitar players did not invent persistent downstroked palm muting styles, all right? This approach to guitar playing had been around at least since the days of acoustic blues players. So this is not a new technique. But a fresh sound was achieved because of the incredible strumming speed, right? So they used these complementary inventions, palm muting, downstroke, that sort of thing, right? But they used it in a new way, played it much faster in the context of heavy metal, right? So it was an innovation, to guitar playing, but it's based on an old invention or old inventions, if you like, okay? Again, as mentioned with tremolo picking, that involves rapidly striking guitar strings back and forth. And this was common to many musical forms in the 1950s and before, such as surf music, jazz, bluegrass, just to name a couple examples, right? Dick Dale, and surf music, right? That's basically tremolo picking, right? With some palm muting as well. Okay, so again, heavy metal didn't invent, these were inventions that occurred before, but it was integrated in the innovative process, and particularly in the hands of black metal players and occasionally death and thrash guitarists. This technique in highly distorted form, so tremolo picking, creates this suffocating, swarming, buzzing sound that adds to the aggressive, heavy, evil milieu that they're trying to create in ways that previous metal could not realize, okay? And a couple other things we can add in. Add to this the deliberate underproduction championed by certain black metal artists, deliberately producing records that sounded really underproduced. The so-called necro sound, common to especially early black metal. And it created an incredibly cold and unsettling atmosphere is why they did it, right? Other integrations, again, to things that weren't invented by heavy metal players, right? But again, were inventions that were integrated in a new innovative way. Things like alternative tunings, right? The integration of drop D and other alternative tunings made metal bands sound heavier and or more alien than ever before, even if these guitar tuning techniques had been around for decades in other musical environments. Yeah, some metal bands came up with their own tuning approaches, that's true, but lots of them used alternative tunings that had been around for decades, right? But they just did it in a new way, okay? So I think you're hopefully you're getting the idea here. Before we leave guitar playing, though, I got to say a couple things about guitar solos, because let's face it, guitar solos are fundamental to most forms of heavy metal. In heavy metal, almost every song, 90% of songs have guitar solos. So we should mention something about that. And so the integration of disharmonic, chaotic guitar breaks that ignore standardized scale structures, right? Again, staples of many freeform jazz players. So again, this wasn't unique. And the dependence on a litany of effects pedals and whammy bar gymnastics, whammy bar had been around a long time too, added immensely to certain thrash acts and the majority of death metal players. Okay? Now, if you've ever listened to a Slayer guitar solo, whether it be Kerry Kane or Jeff Hanneman or most recently Gary Holt, then you will know exactly what I'm referring to here as far as the chaotic guitar breaks, right? They're ridiculously disordered solos that somehow still made sense, could rightfully be termed dissonance jazz applied to heavy metal. That always blew me away about Slayer in particular, right? I mean, their riffs and the song structures were generally, fairly standard, just played really fast and palm muted, etc. But their solos were just from another world almost, right? Almost free form. I would argue they basically were jazz. It was a jazz approach, right? And this, they created these solos that just seemed to come out of nowhere, but still made sense. It seemed like a whole lot of wild sounds, almost randomly thrown at you, but it still made sense somehow. I don't know how they did it, but it was amazing. And I would argue similar applications of jazz soloing, right, were often employed by Exodus, Exciter, and Creator, and a few others, right? But here's the thing. Other thrash bands of the 1980s were playing guitar solos much in line with standardized scales, right? Albeit at unbelievable tempos, like the speed they were playing it at was unbelievable, but they were using standardized scales to craft their solos. And again, I'm thinking examples like Metallica, Anthrax, Megadeth, Testament. I mean, for example, Kirk Hammett from Metallica, Alex Skolnick from Testament. I mean, all the guitarists that were in Megadeth, these were really, really schooled musicians, right? They really knew what they were doing. I mean, Kirk Hammett and Skolnick from Testament were actually students of the guitar, wizard Joe Satriani, right? And he was a big stickler for guitar theory and all that sort of stuff. So these guys are really well schooled in the theory of guitar. So their solos are well worked out. They're based on standard scales. Their notes all make sense, all that sort of stuff. So in other words, they follow the rules, right? So again, the point I'm making here is whether your guitar solos are based on standardized scales, albeit at really fast, or you're taking the jazz approach of Slayer, these are not new things, all right? They're incorporated in a new way, but they're not new techniques, in other words, right? That's why these are innovations, not inventions, right? Again, talking a little more about Slayer. Elsewhere, Slayer's highly effective riffs built on palm muting, bar chords, and fifths were really not anything new. right? Just done in a new way within an environment of incredible speed, as I've been saying. Many players within death metal in particular followed Slayer's approach, and Slayer's growing reputation as one of the most innovative and influential bands in metal often overshadows the fact that they were not inventors. Slayer were innovators, incredibly important innovators, but really they didn't invent anything, right? Got to mention something about Eddie Van Halen because this fits in really well. I mean, if you're talking guitar solos in hard rock or heavy metal, I guess you should mention Eddie, right? Because Eddie Van Halen is probably the most celebrated guitar player in heavy music, at least since Jimi Hendrix, right? So a lot of what I'm talking about, this parallels Eddie Van Halen's much celebrated right hand tapping technique, right? He did it in a lot of his solos, and he did it really great, of course, but perhaps most famously displayed in Eruption off the first Van Halen album, right? Now, contrary to popular opinion, Van Halen did not invent tapping. Well, I guess it's not as popular now that people think that, but back in the day, they thought Eddie invented this, right? He didn't. But it is fair to say that no one incorporated the tapping technique in a more innovative manner within the hard rock or heavy metal communities. Okay, I think that's the way we need to look at this. In terms of electric guitar solos, Eddie was an innovator with a capital I, one of the most important players of all time, like full stop, right? Perhaps the most important one since Hendrix, as I was saying, right? But in truth, Eddie didn't invent anything, okay? He wasn't an inventor. He was an exceptional innovator who took what was done before and did it in just excitingly new ways. That's innovation, not invention, okay? Okay, so enough on the guitar players. So again, we're looking at how these complementary inventions helped bring the original invention of heavy metal towards the subgenres, which were innovations. Okay, a couple more examples here to finish this off. The death growl in death metal, you know, that sort of thing. Or otherworldly guttural shrieks that you get in black metal. I can't usually do those, but, you know, anyway. Let's just say in general, all tortured larynx vocal deliveries, all of these things should be viewed as key innovations, not inventions. Okay, a lot of people like to think that death metal bands invented the death growl. No, they didn't. Okay, but anyway, these approaches to vocalizations definitely separated most death and black metal bands from their thrash and other metal cousins. I mean, for example, it's sometimes, you know, there's in some cases there's not a big difference between thrash metal and death metal in particular. I mean, both play really fast, both are technically through the roof in musicianship, both deal with really dark matter, all that sort of stuff, right? But thrash metal will rarely use, if ever, the death growl, right? They'll sing very strained and sometimes very raspy, but it doesn't usually dissolve into a true death growl, whereas death metal almost always will use the death metal growl, right? So that's usually a big separator between thrash and death metal, for example. But regardless, speaking, singing, shouting like the Cookie Monster, if you will, or screeching like a demon-possessed zealot, as you would in black metal, has been utilized by actors and performers since at least the inventions of traditional horror films. So again, this is not new, right? While black metal and death metal musicians did not create these types of vocals, they certainly use them within a different form, for sure. Okay, so again, the same idea. They didn't invent this stuff, but they used it in a new, innovative way. Okay, let's talk about the drummers for a second. In a similar way, blast beat drumming, and what blast beat drumming is usually refers to is it's sort of running on the kick drums, on the bass drums with your feet, or hitting the snares, right, at speeds that actually blur the notes into a percussive haze, right? I mean, I'm actually like sometimes drums are triggered, but lots of times this is all human, and it's amazing to me how fast these drummers can play. Like it's mind-boggling. right? But anyway, these blast beats help differentiate thrash, death, and black metal from other more conventional forms of heavy metal, power metal, doom metal, etc. Okay, again, I would argue these are not inventions. This is not new. For centuries, various indigenous tribes have used drums and other forms of percussion for various rituals and entertainment, okay? While not having the benefits of amplification that, say, a death metal drummer has, right? A team of acoustic drummers could produce the same blast beat effect if approached with enough vigor. And certainly, you can go to YouTube. There are demonstrations of indigenous tribes, you know, pounding the drums, like a whole team of them. And it sounds like when you've got got 5 or 6 to 10 drummers pounding away really fast, it sounds like blast beats. And sometimes they'll play for hours to induce like trances and all that sort of thing, right? So I guess what I'm saying here is blast beats, distorted vocalizations, and these types of things are essentially timeless ideas reframed in new musical settings. Okay, so is innovative as bands that like Venom and Celtic Frost and Immortal and Incantation are and were, to effectively integrate these inventions. Okay, that took a lot of know-how and a lot of insight. These are not inventors per se. Okay, so just to summarize this, in summary, subgenres such as thrash, death, and black metal are innovations on a previous form of music, i.e., the invention of original heavy metal from the late 60s, early 70s. Yet, by incorporating inventions from other arenas, whether that be palm muting, persistent downstroking, tremolo picking, alternative tunings, death growls, blast beats, what have you, right? By incorporating these inventions, significant variations on the heavy metal blueprint was achieved, right? Just as the invention of sugar-free sweeteners helped cola manufacturers to innovatively develop variations on an old product, okay? So the subgenres were innovations on the original heavy metal blueprint. They integrated inventions from outside in a new way, essentially. Okay, so that was part 4. In part 5, what I'm going to do, part 5 and part 6, actually, we're going to more precisely look at the, again, mostly sort of still dealing with the heavy metal subgenres, I guess, but we're going to really contrast the really striking innovators, the people who are really pushing things forward, from artists and heavy bands that just follow or amalgamate, right? And so in part 5, I'm going to talk about the followers in heavy metal, right? And so these would be bands that pretty much just redo what's been done. They're not innovators. They're certainly not inventors. They're kind of just redoing what's been done. They might do it in really interesting ways, but they're not really adding anything new. So we're going to talk about those types of bands. And that doesn't mean they're bad. They can still be really interesting. Or the amalgamators that sort of take, if you like, the best parts of 2 or 3 different bands and kind of put them together in a repackaged way, but at the same time really aren't doing anything new either, right? And then we're going to compare those to the real wild innovators that are really pushing music forward. And in that section, I'll especially be talking about prog rock and prog metal. Okay, so I hope you'll join me for those sections of this discussion. And until then, stay heavy and, of course, stay well. Take care.